Over the past few centuries, the idea of race has become the dominant means of stereotyping and classifying people in the Western world. The idea that people must be lumped together based on shared physical features has been a means of social dominance by some groups over the others, and has damaged the minds of people who continue to participate in interpreting the world through that type of lens. Now, the idea of race is purely imaginative, as we'll see as we continue going through these series of lectures, but the effects of that idea of race are absolutely real. Now, to wrap our heads around this narrow view of the world known as race, and to get an understanding on how it works and functions in our society, we go to the grand master on the topic of race, social anthropologist Dr. Audrey Smedley, in her book right here called Race in North America. Now, this here is a classic on the topic of race. It provides a complete overview of the racial system and ideology, and it also breaks it down in simple terms, right? And so when we go in here into the preface and the introduction of this book, it's got enough gems in here that will keep you busy for months, like going over the information that is in here. And so early in the preface, what Dr. Smedley talks about is how the scientists had unpacked the genetic code of the humans. And what they found is that upwards of 99.9% of the genetic makeup of humans is the same across the board. And from that findings, what the scientific community came to understand is that the idea of race had no genetic basis or foundation or relevance. And so this is what Dr. Audrey Smedley says.
Most scientists are now declaring that race has no basis in the biological sciences. More and more are concurring that it should be seen as a social invention.
There is no such thing as biological race because nobody can agree on racial categories, right? So we can't agree on how many there are, basically, because what the categories that people use in the United States are different than somebody would use in Brazil, right? Or somewhere else in the world. So there's no categories or number of categories or that people agree on. So that's one big problem. The other problem is that humans vary in a continuous way. So we might say, oh, you have really light skin, you're white, right? Or you're black. I don't like to use those terms because nobody's white, nobody's black, right? But you can say you have really fair skin and you have really dark skin. But the thing is there's something there everywhere in between. So in that sense, there's just no way to break up, let's say, skin color into races. Right. And so the other thing about races is there's no set of character. There's no one character that you can only find in certain groups. Right. So within, let's say, Africa, which is the most of diversity, Africa has more variation than in any other place in the world. And you have people with skinny noses and people with wide noses. You have people with lighter skin and people with darker skin. You have people with straight hair. You have people with curly hair. Right. So you have people who have something that looks like an epicanthic eye fold, which people typically tend to associate with people from Asia, but you can find that in Africa too. Right. So there's no set of characteristics that people can use to define any. First, we can't agree on how many there are. Then we can't agree on what characters define them. And so the question is, why do we even bother? Right? Why? Because humans like to categorize things, right? Yeah. And the thing is, I think an important point is to say that just because we would say there's no biological reality to race, that doesn't mean that race doesn't have real biological consequences. So because people continue to put other people in different racial categories, there's biological consequences related to stress of being stigmatized or being stereotyped or not having the access to the same resources or all of these things. So there's real biological consequences to the social construct of race.
Most scientists are now declaring that race has no basis in the biological sciences. More and more are concurring that it should be seen as a social invention.
What is a social invention? You're going to hear about this term, social invention or social construction, many times, so it's important for us to understand what this is. When we're talking about a social invention or social construction, we're talking about ideas or imposed meanings that humans are creating and other humans are agreeing upon. And these ideas or imposed meanings are things that exist in the world of imagination. And when you truly understand this idea, then you'll understand that also a significant portion of human society revolves around this idea of being socially constructed. And so what are some of the examples of a social construction? One, you have race, which is what we're talking about. Race is a social construction. How? You have people that call themselves black people. You have people that call themselves white people. Both of these exist in people's imagination. You have one group who's called black, who believe themselves to be black, but they don't have black skin. You also have another group who believes themselves to be white, and they also do not have white skin. These are socially accepted terms and ideas who people have agreed upon and said, okay, we will agree to call people these types of terms. Social statuses such as low, middle class, upper class, these are social inventions too, meaning that humans are the creators of these ideas and they're also the sustainers of these ideas. So in one society, you may have a group of people known as the lower class who make less than, let's say, like $20,000 per year. The middle class could be anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000 per year. Upper class could be whatever, anything past $100,000. Another society can say, okay, instead of making money the symbol of status, they can make self-development or self-control a symbol of status. And you can say someone who has no control of themselves, that's a low-class citizen. Someone who has some type of control over themselves, okay, that could be the middle class type of person. And someone who has a great amount of control of themselves, that could be an upper class types of citizens, right? You could just come up with any types of ideas. Then what happens? When the people agree upon these ideas, now you have a social construct of which you can operate from. The point to understand is that societies could modify any of these social constructs in any way that they imagine to fit best and work best for the goals that they have in mind. Okay, so religion is another social invention, and you can understand this by looking at the sheer amount of religions that are available in the world, right? People can have one text, and then you can have multiple people create different religions just from that one text, right? That's letting you know that there's some people who are seeing the text, they're interpreting it in a certain way. Other people are also saying, oh yeah, we agree with that interpretation. They go off and go form a particular religion. Then you may have someone with contrasting views who say, oh, I see it a different way. They go another way, and there's other people who are persuaded by those ideas. They come together and they say, we agree upon these interpretations. These are socially constructed ideas, right? And the important thing to understand with all this being said is that it's extremely important for humans to have socially invented ideas. Why is that? Because in order to have a society, you need to have ideas that people can agree upon, right? So if you want to have some type of law, order, structure, some type of morality, you have to have these ideas, and people come to the society and saying, yes, we agree upon that, right? And they function within that agreement. The problem comes in when you have socially constructed ideas that are meant to destroy people, and ideas that are meant to only benefit just small groups of people while damaging and degrading other groups of people, right? And so the idea of race is one of those socially agreed upon ideas that does that, right? And so this is what Dr. Audrey Smedley says. Here we go.
We must investigate the social meanings imposed on the varying human populations to understand race.
So we have to understand what is meant by black, and we have to understand what is meant by white. What are these ideas that people are agreeing to when they're acquiescing and saying yes to the system and the idea of race? Now, when you start to understand what these racial terms are implying and what they're really meaning, then you can pop the blindfold off around your eyes, and you can start to see the whole system for what it really is. Now, what is the racial system really about? I want you to listen closely right now to what Dr. Audrey Smedley is about to say. Here we go.
Study shows that the elements of the ideology of race have been utilized since the 18th century as a mechanism to stratify society and accord privileges, benefits, and rights to some and not to others, with the justification that the groups called races are innately unequal and that their differences cannot be transcended.
The socially invented and agreed upon idea known as race has been used since the 1700s as a tool to stratify or rank people from top to bottom and give certain people who are at the top certain privileges, benefits, rights that other people at the bottom do not get. In other words, if someone is labeled as a white person, they agree to that term and they say, yes, we're going in as a white person. There are certain benefits that you get, certain social statuses that you get. On the contrary, if you're someone who calls themselves a black person, if you go into the idea and you agree to the idea of race, and you agree to you being a black person, boom, you go to the bottom of the totem pole. You don't get those privileges, and you get a worldview down there at the bottom in the pit of victimhood, of being the footstool for everyone else to lay their feet upon. Right? This is the system that you agree upon, you acquiesce to, right? And it goes way more in depth into it, in a book called The Racial Contract, right? This is a system now that was imposed in the beginning, but now it's something that people agree upon willingly. It can get spicy in here at any moment. Here we go. Now, what's also striking about this system, this racial worldview that people agree upon now, is that it makes the claim that people known as races, they are born in a status of being unequal to one another, right? And so what Dr. Smedley is saying is that you cannot transcend that status. When you go in there talking about you're a black person, you can't transcend the status of being at the bottom. When you acquiesce and agree to the racial worldview, right? When you agree to that social construct, you're at the bottom, right? You can't shake your way out of that, right? And she's going to talk more about it as we continue going in the preface. And so this racial worldview is a system that's set up to keep certain groups of people at the bottom permanently, right? Permanently. That's the key word that we want to understand, which is why it's important for people to remove themselves, who's talking about equality, remove yourself from that type of thinking. The more people, when you start removing from that type of thinking, then that thing goes away. If you stay within the system, thinking in terms of the system, you're in there. You're lumped in there as well, right? And so that's the purpose of these discussions and these lectures, to help remove people's thoughts and imaginations from those systems that are meant to destroy, damage, and degrade people, right? Here we go. Let's get some more.
Arguments about hereditary differences and their mutability have been critical to constructing and preserving race ideology from the beginning. When these beliefs have been linked to such natural features as skin color and other physical differences, race assumes the status of an unassailable truth. This is why the conditioning to the belief in the reality of race has been so powerful and so difficult to eliminate.
You can't change your skin color. The idea that follows is that you cannot change your race. And this unchangeable aspect of the race ideology is what made it such a powerful tool for the colonizers in creating permanent slaves. And this ideology has woven itself within the fabric of the culture of Western society. So intertwined is it that people cannot imagine themselves being an identity of anything different from a color in a crayon box, right? And an incorrect color at that. Now, as silly as this idea may seem, it has very powerful effects upon the mind and the psychology and the actual actions of people. And as silly of a concept as it is, it's very difficult to eliminate, right?
Those Europeans who came to dominate the colonial world of 18th century America created a world in which the status of whiteness achieved supremacy, while inferior or lower status identities were imposed on those populations encountered and exploited in the New World, also in Asia and later Africa.
So how did the European colonists who came to dominate the New World create a world in which whiteness reigned supreme? How did they do that? Well, one of the ways they did it was with supreme military, weaponry, psychology. They had all these tactics which they had developed over time, right? And by force, they came in and forced people to acquiesce and to agree to that racial worldview, right? Where whiteness would be held up at the top. And obviously we know that the blackness, which was attached to people with brown skin, would be held at the bottom of the rung of the ladder, right? And so this is a thing by force, which is important for us to understand, because no one is going to come in here and yes, sign me up for the idea of blackness where I can go down here and be the lowest rung on the ladder, right? That wasn't the thinking that people in their right mind aren't going to accept, right? When you have a mind that's been distorted, sure, people will accept it in today's time. They'll take that today because that's all they know. But when it initially was set up, people weren't volunteering to say, yes, put us on the bottom of the rung of the ladder. We want to be slaves. That's not what was happening, right? But they came with that hot firepower, right? That weaponry. They had tactics and psychological tactics that people weren't used to dealing with, right? And they took this slavery thing to a whole new level, stealing minds at this point, right? They take the whole mind and soul and replace it with something else, an inferior person. And they came and they did this throughout the world, right? They introduced that system over there to, like Dr. Smedley is saying, to Asia, and then later over there into Africa. They have parts of it that are being set up, right? For those people being looked at as the inferior people. And then they start to believe it within themselves. Hold on, maybe we are the inferior. Then they start to perpetuate it. We're talking about perpetual slaves here. Now, let's go from here and let's go on to page 6 so we can get a little bit more understanding.
The people most instrumental in the development of the idea of race as experienced in North America were the English colonists who began settlement in the 17th century. Under the English customs and beliefs, Europeans in the United States developed and institutionalized the concept of race more extreme than any other society outside of 20th century South Africa.
So the English, which we're reading about in other series as well, the English are the one who brought this mindset over to the Americas, right? And you got to remember the English were extremely ethnocentric. They believing that the world revolved around them, right? And so they measured everyone against their own standards. And so they came with this ideology. And the United States was settled primarily by the English. And the English over time developed the most rigorous racial system out of everyone else in the entire world. They really wanted to express their superiority. Did they do so? And did they succeed? You better believe they did. We can still see the effects of it today from that system that they set up.
The race system that evolved in the United States is distinctive in several ways. First, the dichotomous race categories of black and white are set and inflexible. Unlike in South Africa or Latin America, there is no legal or social recognition of a racial category in between black and white, mixed race, or colored, and one cannot belong to more than one race.
And this is how it developed here in the United States. And so the good thing is that nobody's actually black in color, nobody's actually white in color. So people can go and reinvent themselves if they want to get out of the racial worldview. These are some of the initial steps that people can take, right? It's not the end all be all, but it is a beginning. Reinventing what people identify as. Along with that comes a change in culture, a change in attitude, a change in beliefs, right? An entire different reinvention has to take place, or else people will just be stuck in that destructive racial worldview, right? Which is meant to destroy.
Second, the category black or African American is defined by any known descent from a black ancestor, thus conflating and socially homogenizing individuals with a wide range of phenotypes and ancestries into one racial category.
So why did the colonizers lump all these people together who do vary in phenotype? Some people have different shaped noses, some people have different shaped lips, different ears. The only thing that's somewhat similar, and it's not even all the way similar across the board, is the skin color. Why did they lump these people together? For one reason, to make it easy to know who it is that's supposed to be dominated. Simple and plain. No other reason. That's what it's for. Who's supposed to be dominated? That's who we're pointing to, who's supposed to be black. Right? And so the idea is for you to remove yourself from the trap that they have laid.
Third, one cannot transcend or transform one's race status. No legal or social mechanism exists for changing one's race. Under the system of apartheid in South Africa, a government board existed that reassigned hundreds of people every year to different racial categories.
So if the government of South Africa was able to rearrange hundreds of people's racial category year by year, what does that tell us about the idea of race? That is a social invention. It's something that people agree upon, right? And so one year you may have a category or a classification of white folks, and you may say, this is what you need in order to be classified as white. Another year, you may have a different criteria of who's classified as white. When you look at the history of the United States of America, you'll find out that this category of white has been changing all over the place. That people who would classify themselves as white today, many of those people wouldn't have met the criteria in the earlier stages. It's fluid, it changes, right? And also the same thing for blackness. It changed over time, right? They're trying to keep this racial ideology still alive, keeping it going. Who does it now? The people who are involved in there. They keep the system alive, right? Big agents for the system. Why? Because they don't understand the human creative ability. They think that they just woke up one morning as a black person. They woke up one morning as a white person. This is how it's always been. Nothing we can do about it. But the people who are on the outside, who know how this thing works, they know that this thing is changeable. You can create identities. You can mold identities. You can change cultures. You can change all these things. Right? And if you don't do it, somebody else will do it for you. That's how it is.
In much of Latin America, exclusive racial categories do not exist, although descriptive terms are used to reflect the perceptions of individuals with varying degrees of admixture of Indian, African, and Spanish or Portuguese ancestry. In many areas, individuals may shift between Indian and mestizo ethnic identities with ease, although their physical traits do not change. And lower status people of more Negroid physiognomies may be transformed to higher social status, whitened by virtue of education, wealth, or professional accomplishments. In the United States, neither social class, education, wealth, nor professional, governmental, or business achievements evoke a change in race identity.
So in the United States, when you submit to the racial worldview, and especially if you identify as a black person, then there's nothing you can do to transcend that low debased status. That's where you permanently have set yourself up and your descendants up as well, as a debased people. And like Dr. Audrey Smedley says, that no matter how much wealth you get, how much business you get, how much education you get, that it doesn't change the fact that you're still at the bottom of the barrel, right? When you accept that racial ideology of being a black person. And this is why you get some people who say things like, it doesn't matter how much money or success you get, you're always going to be an N-word in their eyes. This is what they're talking about. They understand this on a conscious and an unconscious level. The idea is to do something about it. What are you going to do about it? Yeah, they got you at the bottom. What are you going to do about it? And so what we did is we removed ourselves from that identity and that worldview, right? We created our own identity, Earpoise, and we said, nope, we're not dealing with that because we know what that's about, right? So I'm encouraging other people to think about it, understand the concepts, and then make moves, right? Do something about it. Because if you continue to participate in this identification and this racial system, then you only get what comes out of it, right? And you can see the patterns over and over. It's going to be the same thing. It's not going to be much that changes. Change in identity, change in culture, right? Change in attitudes. These things have to change. They have to change, or the same cycle will continue going, thus fulfilling the prophecy of the English colonizers as creating permanent slaves, right? So this is the end of part 1 for the book right here, Race in North America, Origin and Evolution of a Worldview by Dr. Audrey Smedley. And stay tuned for part 2, because we're going to be going into the other ways in which people have identified themselves outside of the race ideology for thousands of years, right? So you don't want to miss part 2. So I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on part 2 in this series.